Good morning. At the church that meets here in Kaysville, we are continuing a process we begun several weeks ago. We look at the church in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 1 as Paul wrote a letter to that church, and he addressed it to all the saints, including the overseers and deacons. And so we've been talking about what that distinction is between deacon and overseer. Other designations for overseer in the Bible include bishop, pastor, or shepherd, if you will, more common expression, elder. That all talks about the same office, the same person and function in the local church. We spent some time talking about deacons and what type of men the Bible describes are fit to serve in this capacity. And now we're looking at the character this morning of shepherds. We have two elders, we have two shepherds, if you will, at this church. And though it's a congregational process to select and appoint additional elders or shepherds, I think it's important that they still direct this process. And so we've got some handouts, questionnaires maybe is the right phrase. But nonetheless, a few weeks ago, they handed those out to everybody, our elders did, and asked you to, having first talked to these men, indicate on those two papers which men you think ought to be appointed and serve as deacons and as elders. They've asked that you have those finished and given back to either Paul or Rob today. So you still have this afternoon if you need to talk to some people and do a little thinking on this subject. But otherwise, we're kind of moving along in this process, and that's how they've overseen this. But again, at the end of the day, it's up to us as a congregation to actually do the selecting process, the idea of considering and examining certain men in this congregation as to whether they fit the description of an elder in the New Testament. And so towards that end, I hope you would be mindful of the subject this morning, the two primary scriptures we're going to be spending our time in. You see on the screen there, 1 Timothy chapter 3. And as was just read for us a moment ago, Titus chapter 1. So I hope you'd be giving some thought and have been giving some thought to this subject and to those texts. And this morning, it's, again, I really hope you'll be thinking about it as we work through the text and think about who do we want to appoint as overseers? Who do we want to appoint as shepherds over this local congregation? Who are the men that we look to as leaders who are everything that God describes in the New Testament as fitting this role? And so give some serious thought to this. Now, typically, when we think about appointing elders, a common approach has been to take these two scriptures, 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1, and kind of boil them down to two different lists. And that's always the assumption that they are two different lists and that they need to be combined to get, one master list. And it becomes kind of a rather technical process. But I'm not sure that's really what Paul intended. I think Paul was painting in a little bit more broad brushstrokes than we've often approached this subject. We're going to look at character. Last week we considered Psalm 23, the psalm that David, who was a shepherd in his youth and became king a little bit later in life, he understands what it means to be a shepherd. And so we need to understand from a shepherd's perspective what makes somebody a good shepherd. So we talked about that last week. But this week, we're going to talk about character, because that's what these two scriptures deal with. Paul describes the type of character a man needs to have. Now, this isn't everything. This isn't everything that would make a man qualified. We need to consider, does he have the capability to do this work? He might be a man of great character, but, there's other factors to consider if he's really capable of doing the work. But character is a must. And so that's what's emphasized in these two scriptures is character, the character of a man who would be appointed as an elder. And I'd like to break it down this morning in just three basic concepts. I'd like to generalize it a little bit talk about the type of character that this man must have as we are considering who among us ought to be appointed as an elder. First thing I'd like to point out from these two scriptures, and I'm just going to combine them a little bit, but more a matter of their thought. Like I said, in more broad or general terms this morning, because Paul is describing a man who has godly character. And the first thing we understand as we read these two scriptures, and we will in just a moment, is someone who would serve as an elder, someone who would be a shepherd, they must be a good man. What I mean by this is a man of good character, sound judgment, they make good decisions in life, but first and foremost, they display godly character in their lives. They're men of integrity. So that's what we're looking for, is men who are good. They're good men. They display good judgment in their lives. When we look at 1 Timothy, and let's turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 3 first of all. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, we find both positive attributes that an elder then must be. It describes what he positively must be. We find also some negative attributes. He must not be these things. But I'd like to suggest to you as we look at this, and I'm just going to put them all up there for you to look at as we talk about these concepts. You have kind of two columns, and again, this is just a summary of what's in both of these two scriptures. One column of positive attributes, one column of negative attributes, and really blameless, though, that's where we're going to start. The idea of blameless or above reproach, depending on your translation, I really think this is the primary consideration here. And when you read the text and imagine it being read out loud, especially, as both of these letters were probably dictated to a scribe. So Paul didn't sit down and write this and think about it. Paul was speaking it, and when it was brought to these congregations, it was probably read out loud rather than mass-produced and distributed for them to read silently to themselves. So imagine this being read out loud, and you really get a sense that being above reproach or blameless is the primary consideration here as we talk about this man's character. So in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1, it is a trustworthy statement, if any man aspires to the office of overseer, it is a fine work he desires to do. So we understand a man needs to desire. It's something he aspires to, and I hope we all understand that. Like I said, I hope we're all focusing on this. We're thinking about these things this morning and over the last couple of weeks because this takes time. To be a man or a woman of character, godly morals, and integrity, it doesn't just happen one day. You don't just reach 45, 50 years old and think, well, maybe I'll be an elder now, or that's not how it works. This is the result of aspiration. You know, a little kid says, I want to grow up and be an astronaut. Yeah, that probably won't happen, but he's aspiring to become something. It's a goal that's in front of him, and he's working towards it. And so this is something, as it says here, it's a good work that he aspires or desires to do. So it requires time. You need to build this type of character. So if you're on the younger end of those listening this morning, work towards this. Work towards this. Because this is going to take some time to build this type of character. It doesn't just happen one day. It happens as the result of working or aspiring towards this end. So now 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2, I want you to notice the very first thing mentioned here. An overseer then must be above reproach. You can assume that the rest are must-be's, but he says it attached to the idea of above reproach or blameless. Again, depending on your translation. I wanted to get both, so on the screen I emphasized the New King James language, but I'm reading from the New American Standard, so we get a variety between the two really good translations. But blameless or above reproach, he must be. And it's kind of a run-on sentence from there on out. I get the impression that Paul is saying to Timothy, the type of person you should appoint to this office is a man who is above reproach. Now let me tell you what I mean by that. Above reproach looks like, and so the rest is, in my mind, just a description of what it means to be above reproach. It says he must be above reproach, being the husband of one wife, temperate, prudent, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not addicted to wine or pugnacious, but gentle and uncontentious, free from the love of money. He must be one who manages his own household well, keeping his children under control with all dignity. Going down to verse 6, not a new convert, lest he become conceited and fall into the condemnation incurred by the devil, and he must have a good reputation with those outside the church, so that he may not fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. But if we go to Titus chapter 1, and it's interesting how these are both letters to young evangelists, young preachers, and there's often an assumption that these represent two different lists, and that perhaps Titus has additional qualifications that Timothy didn't, but that doesn't seem right to me when I think about it in those terms, because again, I think Paul, rather than being technical or overly specific, I think Paul is speaking in generalizations, that you're looking for a man who has impeccable character. And he just gives some examples of what that looks like. I think that thought is a little more evident, though, in Titus chapter 1. If you read along with me in verse 5, notice again the first thing. For this reason I left you in Crete, that you might set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. Namely, or chiefly, if you will, he says, first thing, if any man be above reproach. So he starts in the same place, which again I think is the primary consideration, is this man must have impeccable character. He must be a godly man. So he has to be above reproach. Namely, if any man be above reproach, the husband of one wife, having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion, for the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward. Are you noticing a theme here? Twice for emphasis. Again, that's why I really think this is the primary consideration in this text, is a man who has great character, who is above reproach. So again, in verse 7 of Titus chapter 1, for the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, not fond of sordid gain, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, just, devout, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful word which is in accordance with the teaching, that he may be able both to exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict. So again, I see this as Paul giving a general description that a man who would be an elder must have great character. He must be a man who is above reproach. What I mean by that is he's a good husband, he's a good father, he's not a drunk, and he goes on and describes what he means by being above reproach. And so as we look over some of these attributes, character attributes on the screen, we need to understand that this is not an exhaustive list. This does not include everything. This man we're looking at to be an elder, he looks great. Everything checks out, but he did murder somebody, but it doesn't say that in the text that's going to disqualify him. So I get, do you see my point here? It doesn't include everything. It doesn't specify he must not be an idolater. I mean, these words are speaking in very broad expressions. Sober-minded, temperate, of good behavior. Do you see how Paul isn't aiming for technical and specific here? These are broad brushstrokes. He's describing good character. So this is not an exhaustive list. This is a generalized list. But we should know what good character looks like because the Bible describes it to us. In the example of Jesus, in the teachings of Jesus. We're looking for a man who just exemplifies the teachings of Jesus. And many of these words, they overlap in their definitions. And some of them almost seem like synonyms with each other. So I think it would be wise not to define them to the point of confusion. And rather than making too fine of distinctions in these words, I think it would be wise to simply view them as Paul describing a picture of a godly man. Something else we notice about some of these attributes is they're kind of subjective in nature. What makes a man temperate? What makes a man hospitable? Well, that's kind of based upon the perception that other people have of this man. It's a little bit subjective in its nature. So again, far from being technical and to a fine point, Paul is being broad and generic in his description here. We have to make a judgment about this man. What makes a man above reproach? Well, he's only as above reproach as those around him think he is or see him to be. And so it's a matter of judgment to a large degree. And furthermore, it's not overly specific either. Not a novice, not a new convert. Well, Paul, could you specify how many years does this guy have to be a Christian? 5, 10? Does he have to be a Christian for 20 years? What constitutes somebody who is not a novice, somebody who is not a new convert? At what point, so Paul leaves a lot of that up to our judgment. We have to make a judgment call on these men. And so, again, far from being an exhaustive list, this is just a description of here's what character that is above reproach. So let's talk a little bit about each of these. And again, as I've already pointed out, blameless or above reproach, I think that's really the key or primary consideration here in both of these scriptures, especially when we see Paul's emphasis in the letter to Titus. This doesn't mean this man has never sinned. We all have. Everybody has. Paul said that in Romans chapter 3 and verse 23. So clearly, above reproach doesn't mean, he's never done anything wrong because, well, that's kind of the way people look at this. Is we're considering brother so-and-so to be an elder, and, well, I remember, when he did this, or he got angry in class at one time, and, we could find something about everybody here because we've all sinned. We've all done things that are wrong. That's not what above reproach. That's not what blameless means. You could say that blameless means an accusation can't be substantiated. That people might say bad things about him, but really, what evidence do you have? It's not saying people never make an accusation against him. It's just saying when people do make an accusation, it just kind of falls flat. That his character is above that reproach. That's the whole point there. People might reproach him, but his character is proven to be above those reproaches, above those accusations. Really, the question I'm concerned with is this in character or out of character? When a man does something that is sinful, when a man does something that is wrong, as we all do, the question is, was that out of character for him? Yeah, he might have done something one time, like got really angry or something, but he repented, and that was definitely not consistent with his character. I think he's still above reproach. I think he's still above that. Yes, he made a mistake like we all do, but that doesn't indicate that his character was flawed. That just means he had a bad day or a bad incident. But it doesn't mean that that's consistent with his character. We're looking for an element of consistency here. Again, not perfection, but consistently good character. A man who is blameless doesn't harbor sin in his life. He doesn't tolerate sin. He doesn't hide his sins. He learns from his mistakes, and he moves on and repents. And those mistakes are not something that are consistent in his character. That's what we're looking for when it says above reproach. It says he's temperate. And when I think of temperate, I always tend to think in terms of weather. Mild. Not changing drastically. I was in Portland over Thanksgiving. That's where I grew up, Portland, Oregon, and never really gets below freezing in winter, never gets much above 90 in the summer. It's kind of right there in the middle. It fluctuates, very little. Whereas in Utah, it's all the way down here in winter and all the way up here in summer and all over the place. It might be one thing and 10 minutes later, it might be the exact opposite. I would classify Utah weather as bipolar, but Oregon, the high, there was a day I looked at my weather app, the high for that day when I was in Portland was 52, the low at night was 48. That's how much the temperature swings in Portland this time of year. So that's what we're looking at. Again, blameless, it's not perfect. Yes, he's made mistakes, but those mistakes were out of character. They were kind of one-time things. We all make mistakes. We all sin, but it's the idea of being temperate, that he fluctuates very little. Yes, there are fluctuations. Yes, we're not going to find somebody who's perfect aside from Jesus, the Son of God, but he's temperate, which means he's not prone to highs and lows or extremes. He doesn't fly off the handle regularly and then all of a sudden turn right around, or he's not like, we don't see him for months at a time, and then when he does show up at church, he's wanting to teach every Bible class, he's wanting to lead songs and do everything, and he's not up and down and all over the place. He's consistent. That's the idea of temperate. Sober-minded, calm, even-tempered, sound judgment, self-control. Means he doesn't give into emotional fits. He's sober-minded. His thinking is clear. Of good behavior, and that's such a wide open term. I'm not sure how to get very specific with it. I don't think I want to. It just means that he's disciplined in his life. He's not sloppy because he's got a lot of responsibility. We want someone who's responsible. So they generally have good behavior. They're hospitable. We talked about Psalm 23 last week and tried to characterize the type of work these men are to be doing. And one thing I took away from that in Psalm 23 is if you're going to be a shepherd, you got to love sheep. If you're going to be an elder in the church, you got to be a people person. I'm not saying like an entertainer per se, but I mean more that you get along with people, you like people. You ever met somebody and you thought, this guy, he just doesn't like anybody. He's a loner. He might have great character, but I'm sorry, that man shouldn't be an elder. To be a shepherd, you have to like the sheep. And so you got to be hospitable. You got to be warm and welcoming. Yes, maybe that means having them in your home, but that just means treating people with kindness and warmth. So he's got to be hospitable and gentle. Again, think of a shepherd with a sheep. Yes, at times they use the rod and staff to ward off danger, but sometimes they use that to correct. But in general, we're talking about a consistent character here. Is this man consistently gentle? I think the King James says patient, mild-mannered, kind, or fair in his treatment to others. We want somebody who is just. They're fair. They're not going to give special treatment to certain people or family members or things like that. They're fair. They treat others with equity. They're not a schemer. They don't work for themselves. They're not trying to, get themselves farther ahead in life at the expense of other people. But they genuinely care about others, and so they're just. They're holy. That means that God is what matters most in their life, that they are devoted to God, that sin, they're not encumbered by it. You don't question whether their loyalty is to the riches of this world or to God. You know their loyalty is to God. They're holy to God, and they love what is good. Someone who promotes virtue. And I like this expression. Do you love things that are good? Or do you kind of like the things that are wicked? Do you kind of like, things that are questionable, humor that is questionable or of a sexual nature? Do you kind of like things that are a little bit dirty and worldly? Or do you just love what is good, what is pure, what is holy, what is godly, to the point where you don't even care about worldly, sinful, ugly things? This is a man who he loves the light. On the negative side, he's not a novice. And again, we're not given too much specifics on what this means. It just means that if he's not been a Christian for very long, how do you expect him to lead others to Christ? Not given to wine. And here is where I think we start to get overly technical at times. I'll just say this. Again, in my mind, the chief concern here is blameless or above reproach. That people might raise questions about his character, but really it's unsubstantiated because his character is above that. His character proves that those claims are unfounded. A man who doesn't drink any alcohol at all, he's blameless. This does not say he can never drink alcohol ever in any amount under any circumstances. But again, a man who totally abstains, I have no question about him. A man who does drink, it might raise some questions in my mind. But the bottom line here, what Paul is concerned with is this man's judgment is not influenced by alcohol. This is a man who understands the warnings and dangers in the Bible about alcohol. This is a man who understands it's not a good thing generally. And so alcohol doesn't affect him. It doesn't influence his decision-making process. It's not something that has been a trouble in his life. But again, a man who doesn't drink at all, he's clearly above reproach. A man who does, it might raise some questions. Not greedy for money or not fond of sordid gain. Again, you don't question this man's loyalty. Is he in it for wealth and riches? Is that what drives him to get out of bed in the morning to go and make a bunch of money and buy a bunch of stuff for himself and not fond of sordid gain? Or I think the King James says filthy lucre. I always like some of those King James expressions, but he doesn't get his money in a backhanded way. He doesn't get his money in a sleazy way. He comes by it honestly, not through questionable means. So what type of work does he do? I don't know, but he's at the racetracks a lot, or he never can tell me what he does for a living. But I see him hanging around a really odd crowd. A man who's above reproach, I know what he does. I know his job. I know what he does, and it's a legitimate job. He works hard, provides for his family, and he doesn't live for money. That's what Paul said in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He said this later on in the same letter, that the love of money is a root of all sorts of evils. And so here's a man who is not greedy, who does not have that love for money. He's not self-willed, and Philippians 2 and verse 3 says, do nothing from selfishness or selfish ambition, but regarding others as more important than yourself, just as Christ did. Just as Christ on the cross showed us that it's not about doing things for your own self-betterment. It's about doing things that help others, even at your own expense. So he's not self-willed. He's not all about himself. Not quick-tempered. Again, like we said, with moderate or temperate. Yes, he might get fired up at times. He might be a little apathetic at times, like this, but he's not prone to these extremes. He's not going to fly off the handle if you just do, where you're afraid. You walk on eggshells around this man that if I say the wrong thing, he's going to tear me to pieces and dress me down in front of the church, and make me feel embarrassed, or he's going to get all mad. Like, he's not quick-tempered. We know anger has a proper role in our lives, but when we have bursts of anger, outbursts of anger, it's always sinful. It's not a good thing to have an outburst of anger. And he's not quarrelsome. On this, I'm just going to go to Romans chapter 14 really quick. I'm amazed at how many scriptures in the New Testament call for Christians, especially in a congregational sense, to pursue peace, to run after peace. Yet so often we are eager to run towards quarreling, towards fighting, towards bickering over the Bible, rather than trying to be peaceful with one another. Romans chapter 14, and it says in verse 19, so then let us pursue the things which make for peace and the building up of one another. This guy doesn't just pick fights everywhere he goes. He brings people together, makes peace. So again, not an exhaustive list of everything that we go down a list and check it off. It's saying this man must be above reproach, and here's what that looks like. Here's some characteristic attributes that need to be there in his life. And some of them are subjective in nature. Some of them are kind of a judgment call that we look at this man and just ask, is he above any criticism? He's not perfect. He's made mistakes in his life, but are those mistakes an indication of flawed character? Or are those mistakes, do they go against his character? Are they out of character for that man? It's not about perfection. It's not about never sinning. It's about showing throughout your life that you've put God first and you try to be like Jesus in his example. That's what Paul is asking for us to look for here. So he must be a good man, a man of character. But secondly, I'll summarize and say he must be a teaching man. And so a couple of the examples here, when we look at 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1, it says he's able to teach. Other translations, I think, say apt to teach. He's got an aptitude, an ability to instruct. How do you know? How do you know that a man has the ability to teach? Maybe the easiest way is because you've seen him do it. Doesn't mean he has to be up here as a pulpit preacher. And it doesn't say he has to have done, 24 sermons. He has to have completed 50 gospel sermons. He has to have taught, 10 quarters in the adult auditorium class, Again, Paul isn't going for precise and technical here. He's going for general descriptions. A man who can teach. A man who, again, doesn't have to necessarily be from the pulpit, but a man who can take the Bible, condense it down, and teach it to others in a way they understand. So he's a man that can teach. He has the knowledge and ability to teach others about God. It says he holds fast the faithful word. What this means is he relies upon the Bible for guidance in all things. Now, here is a man that when you ask him a question, his answer is going to come from the Bible. He holds fast to the Bible, to the faithful Word of God. This is his rock. Again, Paul's not saying that you have to agree with him on every question that's ever come up in the Bible. It's not saying he has to, every doctrine that you think about, he has to think exactly the same way. No, Paul is saying that here's a man that he goes to the Bible for every question. He leans on the Bible for guidance and relies upon the Word of God in every situation. He believes in the power of the Scriptures. So he holds fast the faithful Word. He's able to exhort and convince. It even goes on to say false teachers. And here's the idea that he uses his intellect. He uses his knowledge. And again, he aspires to this. This doesn't just happen one day. You don't just one day have the ability to teach. The ability to teach comes from studying, from meditating, from reading it for yourself over a long period of time. And so he's able to exhort and convince because he has a knowledge of the Scriptures. And, 1 Peter chapter 5. Peter, I think around verse 3, he says, you're not lording it over the flock, but you're proving as an example. The idea is you don't push people, you don't bully people into submission as an elder. And I think that's the idea here. Exhorting and convincing. He's not just the loudest one, because a lot of times in an argument, the loudest one wins, but it doesn't mean he was right. He's not just the loudest or angriest one. He doesn't just bully people into backing off. He actually reasons with them. He exhorts and he convinces through his intellect, through his understanding of the Scriptures. And it also goes to show he knows the difference between truth and error. So a man who would lead us, who would shepherd us, well, he better know where he's leading us. He had better know the Scriptures. And he's able to stop the mouths of false teachers. In Titus chapter 1, let's read on a couple more verses. Titus chapter 1 in verse 10. So it said in verse 9 that he needs to hold fast the faithful word to be able to exhort and refute those who contradict. Now notice Titus chapter 1 and verse 10. For there are many rebellious men, empty talkers, and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, who must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families, teaching things they should not teach for the sake of sordid gain. I think that's a continuation of this thought of elders, Paul wrote to Titus and said, you need to set in order what's lacking. There's something missing in those churches in Crete. It's elders. Elders who hold fast the faithful word because There are people leading others astray, and they need to be silenced by those faithful men, those elders. Again, this means they have an understanding of the difference between truth and error. They're not afraid of confrontation. Like we noted in our last point, that they're a good man of moral integrity. They're not fighters. They're not looking to quarrel, but they aren't afraid of confrontation when it means standing up for the truth. Because their primary concern is saving souls. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17 says they do this as one who will give an account for the work they've done, as shepherds, as leading others. And that's a weight on their shoulders. And so their concern is not appeasing everybody. Their concern is helping souls to get to heaven. And that means taking a stand for truth. Now, before we move on to our last point here, why is it so important that an elder must be a teaching man? Go to Ephesians chapter 4 for just a moment. Their primary function, if you will, in the local church is to equip. To lead us and equip us to make us prepared to serve others. And so if they're going to equip us, if they're going to give us the tools we need to succeed as Christians and help others and bring others to the Lord, they need to be able to teach us. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11. He gave some as apostles and some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors. There's the word shepherd there. Some as pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of service, to the building up of the body of Christ. So if they're going to equip us, if they're going to help us and give us the tools we need to build ourselves up and be edified spiritually, they need to have an understanding of the Word of God. And lastly, an elder must be a family man, a leader in the home who loves his family. And so again, as we wrap this up, 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 5, why does his family come up? Why do we need to be concerned about this man's family? Because this is a fair indication of the type of leader he would be in the church. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 5, but if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? That's why we look at his relationships in the home. How does he lead? With his wife, with his children? What type of leader is he? And again, far from being a technical list, this is meant to be a description of a man above reproach. What type? It's not just saying, is he married? Okay, check. Does he have kids? Okay, check. It's really asking what type. Is he a good husband? Is he a good father? Is he attentive to the needs of his wife and his children spiritually? Is he a good leader? That's the question Paul wants us to ask about these men. That's what we're supposed to evaluate. Literally, in the Greek, it says, of one wife, a man. Or of one woman, a man, when it says husband of one wife. A lot of questions come up on this. A lot of people do all kinds of gymnastics in the Greek language to come to varying conclusions. I prefer to just take it for what it is. Is he a good husband? Is he married? That's the question we want to ask. People say, well, maybe this is just to root out or weed out polygamists from serving in elders. But I'm sorry, being a polygamist would keep you out of the church in the first place. That's not the reason Paul brings this up. The question is he a good husband? Has he put away his wife? Was she unfaithful and he divorced her and he went and married somebody else? Well, now he's not the husband of only one wife. Well, no, that doesn't immediately disqualify him. The question is he above reproach? So being divorced and then marrying somebody else, that doesn't immediately disqualify this man, but it might beg some questions. Why did his first marriage not work? We talk about a guilty and an innocent person, and I understand why we use those phrases, but is anybody 100% guilty and the other person is 100% innocent? It's not always the case. And so, maybe he had a scriptural right to marry again, but it might bring up some questions. Was he a good husband in his first marriage? And so it's about being above reproach. It's not just about, has he only been married once in his whole life? So we need to ask, is he a good husband? Just think in those terms. Is he a good husband? Does he lead his wife and provide a spiritually refreshing environment in his home? Does he respect her? Does he take care of her the way we read about in Ephesians chapter 5? So just think about in terms, is he a good husband? It says, one who rules his own house well, and on children, having faithful or obedient children. There's a little bit of a question about how this is translated, especially in Titus. But here again is where I just like to give you a few things to think about. Do you think that Paul gave two different lists to Timothy and to Titus? Because the New American Standard in Titus chapter 1 says having believing children. Well, therefore, his children have to be baptized, faithful Christians. Timothy doesn't really specify it that same way. It's more about what kind of father is he. Do his children obey him? And it says and I like what it says. 1 Timothy chapter 3. It's hard to keep this lesson to a short time period, but we're just about at the end here. But I like 1 Timothy chapter 3, what it says here in verse 4. He must be one who manages his own household well, keeping his children under control with all dignity. Now, there's a lot of ways to keep your children under control, but not all those ways are dignified. A man who has to yell, who has to threaten violence, who has to become violent. I'm not just talking about the occasional spanking. I mean someone who has to really become violent and angry with his children. He might be keeping them under control, but that's not in a dignified way. But my point here is getting back to this question about children, and that didn't really specify that they're believing. Now, not every translation, 1 Timothy chapter 1, it says having children who believe. Well, the New King James says having faithful children, dependable, trustworthy children who obey their father. A little bit different thought there. So my question for you to think about, did Timothy appoint some elders without Titus's letter? It's kind of a far stretch to think that Timothy had in his hands the same letter that Paul wrote to Titus. What if Timothy appointed a man? Do you really think this scenario happened? Timothy might have appointed a man that didn't have children who were sound Christians because Paul didn't specify to Timothy, and then a year or two later he gets a hold of Titus's letter and says, oh, whoops, it says believing children, I guess I should have, we have to unappoint you now? Or do you think they're two different lists, or do you think Paul is just describing in general, broad terms, a man of good character? The question again, is he above reproach as a father? That's what we really need to think about. What type of father is he? Rather than focusing so much on, the beliefs of his grown children, it's more a matter of what type of father was he. Now, and again, kind of like with alcohol. I can't say that a man who might have a drink once or twice in a year, I can't say he's immediately disqualified, but that might raise some questions. And kind of the same way, a man who has all children who believe, who all go to church, who are all faithful, sound Christians, that's what I'd prefer. That's what I'd like to see. Now, just because his children don't all go to church, they're grown and moved out of the house, I wouldn't say he's immediately disqualified, but it just begs some questions. Why? Why are his children not faithful to the Lord? Was it a failing of him as a spiritual leader? The question we need to ask is, was he a good father? And one final thing here. More than one child, or can an elder only have one child? If I were to ask for a show of hands, who has children, would you look over at Carl and say, put your hand down, you only got one kid? Or, Javon, what are you doing? You only got one kid, you don't have children. Again, we look at this, I think, too technical. I'm not saying we shouldn't read the Bible and be precise. I'm just saying those parts of Scripture that aren't meant to be so minutely divided should not be. Paul is saying, look for a man who is above reproach. Look for a man whose character is above reproach, who's got excellent character. And it looks like what we just talked about. He's a family man. He's got a great, he's got a good wife, and I think it's important for a man to have a wife that supports him, and perhaps that's what 1 Timothy 3 and verse 11 is talking about, is the wives of elders and deacons. But again, we're looking at general character descriptions here. The elder doesn't have a different or a higher standard than you and I do. It's the same for every Christian. God expects the same out of all of us, that we give our life in serving Him, that we commit ourselves to an entirely complete transformation where we leave the world behind and we put on the new and spiritual life that is in Christ. Same expectation for everybody. So don't look at these two scriptures and think, well, that's a higher standard only if you want to be an elder or deacon. That's for everybody. Elders are just people who have shown throughout their lives a certain consistency of good character. And that's why it says in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 7, that we should remember them and we should consider the outcome of their way of life. We should look at them and say, they've consistently done their best to live a Christ-like life. And they have a good life. I see the outcome of their decisions. I see the outcome of somebody who's committed to Christ and what kind of life that produces, and we should want to imitate their example and their faith. We should all want to be, in these three generalized characteristics, we should all want to be good people of strong moral integrity. We should all want to be teachers. We should all want to be able to lead others to Christ and know the Bible front and back and be good students of the Bible. And we should all want to be good members of our families, whether as husband or wife, to our parents. We should joyfully take care of them in their older age as they took care of our needs as children. And we should just strive to be good families, good husbands, good wives, good fathers, good children, good brothers and sisters. We should all want this. So what we're looking for, people who have displayed this. Nobody's perfect, but we're looking for people that have consistently shown good character. So we're going to sing a song now, and I'd like to make an invitation for anybody that has not committed their life to Christ, who has not put on Christ in baptism and had their sins washed away, for anybody that maybe you see the type of character you should have. Really, this is just taking the entire New Testament, everything that it says about what we should be and the way we should live our lives, and just condensing it down to a couple of verses. If you understand that you've settled for far less than what we've just read about today, if you need to repent, you need to change your life, you need prayers, you need encouragement, well, we invite you right now to make that known as we stand and sing.